interwar years were an endless summer for those who could afford it. Bobby and Mary Cunningham Reed had used her money to create the perfect country house life for themselves at the Hall, 6 Mile Bottom. The great and the good flocked here to be entertained, and their shoot was considered one of the best in England. Mary's gift to Bobby, the lizard, was moored in the south of France, much in vogue amongst the aristocrats, since the Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald said had persuaded the hotels to stay open all summer long. In London, they were the owners of a modest townhouse, where Bobby liked nothing better than showing guests home movies in his private cinema. They had a perfect family life, and it now seemed an auspicious time for Bobby to relaunch his political career at the mother of all houses, the House of Commons. But the 1930s was an era of confusion and bewilderment. Britain was just emerging from the Depression. A prosperous middle class was on the rise, and aristocratic power in Westminster was on the wane. Most ominously of all, storm clouds were gathering all over Europe, and Bobby with his 16mm camera would be there, a witness to the heart of darkness.
He always wanted to be a top dog. He would have loved to have been Prime Minister. I know when big people were talking like Churchill and all this sort of thing, he really used to cry. Tears used to run down his face. I always feel he thinks that only I could have got there. But he just couldn't get along with people. He always seemed to make himself unpopular. Always.
These great big country houses were focuses of where the very rich, the very influential would go, and they would hobnob and they would discuss. There was a great deal of enjoyment, but in certain country houses, the reason for people going there was that they were networking politically.
Politicians couldn't get to 6 Mile Bottom quick enough. They were guaranteed excellent shooting, sumptuous food, and good company. And if a guest or two was in the cabinet, then so much the better for Bobby.
You would have people coming to stay, people like Anthony Eden or Chamberlain and so on. Chamberlain's a very interesting case because despite seeming rather sort of austere, he enjoyed the country house life, and in fact they played musical chairs and they always had to let Chamberlain win, you know, so...
Playing childish games with her father's cronies was bad enough for the 23-year-old hostess. But Mary also had to cope with their frequent memory lapses. Chamberlain was no exception.
P.S. I'm ashamed to say that I carelessly left my tobacco pouch and pipe on the mantelpiece in the library. 1,000 apologies. May they be returned to me?
The people we had there, all the members of Parliament who came down, they always said, oh, of course I come, Barbara, because I'm so fond of Mary. Really, I think, because they're showing off, you see. They came because Cunningham. Mary wouldn't have asked them, and she wouldn't have bothered about them at all.
My dear Mrs. Cunningham Reed, I appear to have left most of my clothes here last night, but probably the accident would have been discovered before now. Thanks for a delightful visit, and I hope that Bobby will not be too long in finding another constituency and rejoining us in the House. Yours sincerely, Neville Chamberlain.
Bobby had been keeping his eye on the safe Conservative seat of Marylebone, and when it came up for grabs in 1932, he was ready. His campaigning skills had been well and truly sharpened since his first political outing at Warrington, 7 years previously.
Warrington was a terrific Labour constituency. Never, ever had Conservatives dared put their foot in it. And of course he won, and the Conservatives nearly dropped dead with surprise.
Bobby had gate-crashed into a world where the aristocracy was in decline, their houses sold, their parliamentary power diminished. But ironically, many of these knobs were now enjoying a period of unprecedented social celebrity, hyped by a sensationalist press, catering to a new mass market. Nothing seemed too trivial for their columns, acres of newsprint were devoted to their jewels, their dogs, and above all, their clothes.
The glamour of the aristocracy partly stemmed from the fact that they dressed so superbly. This sartorial difference was enormously important as far as distinguishing the classes and as far as making the aristocracy seem to belong to a different order of being.
One can hardly believe it in our grudging age, but they enjoyed them. And when, you know, Lady Dudley or some other famous beauty was coming out of her house, people would gather round in crowds and their photographs would be sold rather like cigarette cards or pictures of pop stars now.
The traditional attitudes in Britain were still very deferential. I was struck by the fact that during the general strike, you know, when the classes have been at war, outside the offices of the Times, the pickets touched their caps to Lord Astor, the owner of the Times, as he walked into the building. So it was a very deferential society, and the respect for the nobs and the toffs and the magnificos was still very great indeed. But the discrepancy between the very rich and the very poor was absolutely shattering. And you could just see it, you could feel it, you could smell it. As George Orwell said, you know, the lower classes stank. They couldn't afford dry cleaning and washing and so on.
But Bobby was now campaigning in Marylebone, known as the Peerage constituency, because so many of its MPs raced off to the Lords. But the old guard were not going to open their ranks to this arrogant young upstart, backed by his wife's money and influence. Mary and her friends rallied around him.
When he stood for Marylebone, we all had dinners. I had a dinner, enormous dinner party. He'd chosen the people at the Dorchester. So then we plaqued the thing and voted for him. And nobody thought of doing that. They all were so surprised. Oh, I never thought he might do that, you see. Of course, you got in, you see, quite easily.
The seat was in the bag. Bobby was duly adopted as the official candidate, but not unanimously. His inappropriate outspokenness, lack of respect, and obvious attraction to the wives of politicians was not to Westminster's liking. In an unprecedented move, the caucus formed a rival Conservative association and put up another Tory to keep Bobby out, Sir Basil Blackett.
The idea that we have today that a local MP will really look after his constituency and nurse it very carefully was quite alien to many of the politicians. They simply regarded the constituency as a horse to ride to get them to Westminster, where they could act out things on the national stage and get themselves promoted and get into government and do things.
And one of the things that might happen if Bobby became MP of this constituency would be unendurable. Cunningham Reid, a lord. But since the establishment had sneakily put up Sir Basil, Bobby felt under no compunction to fight fair.
Sir Basil Blackett has suffered a total eclipse at Marylebone. Almost before the paste was dry, 1,000 posters bearing his portrait were blotted out overnight. His horrified supporters finding that Sir Basil's features had vanished beneath the posters of his rival, Captain Cunningham Reid.
He was a cheerful customer, you know, and of course I think he quite enjoyed the discomfiture that he was spreading in the Conservative Party, and they hated him for it. The Conservative Party machine was a very powerful affair, much more powerful than people can quite understand, and of course up till this stage, you see, the old government was still in power.
Bobby threw everything he could into the campaign, his children, his wife, her money. But his deadliest weapon, unwittingly provided by the suffragettes, was that the voting age for women had dropped 9 crucial years, from 30 to 21.
Of course, women fell for him, as usual. They were hypnotised. Matinee idol, going to be our MP. Oh, 3 cheers. He didn't matter what he was, what class, what anything. We were all working class, but my God, he's gorgeous, you know.
So, the Tory story came to an end. Sir Basil was blacked out, and Bobby, triumphant, went to the House of Commons, where he was received with stony silence. The British adore amateurism. And unlike his peers in the House, who detested contact with the public, Bobby loved it and worked extremely hard to earn the respect of his constituents.
You could be excellent, but you couldn't try too hard. You had to be naturally excellent. I mean, you know that story of Lord Ripon? He was the best shot in England. And once some girl went looking for something after breakfast and went into the library and found him practicing changing his 3 guns with his 2 loaders. And this was considered terribly bad form. So never to the point of professional excellence.
Parliament has an effective method for muzzling young firebrands. An MP is simply ignored by the Speaker. Undaunted, Bobby turned to the airwaves, and his weekly wireless broadcasts for the BBC ensured that while his voice might not be heard in the House of Commons, it would be heard in every other house in the land. His persistent filming seemed a little voyeuristic and vulgar to the upper class, who had yet to catch up with the craze that was sweeping the nation.
The cinema during the 1930s was what television was to us. Everybody went. There was a huge building of new cinemas, particularly as a result of the fact that the talkies came in a dramatic fashion, and they made film stars much more immediate figures. And the glamour attached to Hollywood stardom was simply enormous. So that there was a huge excitement about the glamour of these figures who were projected onto the silver screen through hazes of cigarette smoke.
There has always been this kind of connection between aristocracy and actors and actresses. It was intriguing for these great stars, who for the most part had been hat-check girls and lifesavers and things, and suddenly they would arrive in London and find themselves being summoned to dinner by these coroneted grandes dames. And so, of course, you get these friendships with Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford or whatever it is, but they were both getting a sort of kick out of it. The one had punctured the fairyland of the other. I think probably, you know, they saw little enough of each other to keep the fairyland element going.
Britain needed a bit of pizzazz, glamour, and Bobby thought he and Douglas Fairbanks Jr. were just the men for the job.
Criterion Film Productions belonged to Doug Fairbanks and to Marcel Hellman. He was the producer. Marcel and Doug were the sort of backbone of the company, and I think Bobby was the money bags. Probably Mary was the money bags, but, you know, Bobby ostensibly was the money bags.
£5,000 they raised, which was a lot of money in those days, for the production of this film. But unfortunately, Dad said they spent all the money on promotional and giving parties and advertising and signing up the right people. By the time the film started, there was no money.
They ran neck and neck, Bobby and Dougie, because they were both very handsome men. I think they were all after the same girls. I don't know whether they used to toss a penny for it or what. But I mean, you know, there was always this little one there and that little one there. But we knew him as being sort of one of the top dogs, you know. One used to bow and scrape when he came in. But he very soon showed us that he wasn't all that interested in that. He was much more interested in the girls that were under contract. I was one of them.
Dougie and Bobby's agenda may have been clear, but their partner, Marcel Hellman, was a proper film producer. He was highly successful in Germany. But one night in 1934, he and his wife Ellie decided to leave. He was a Hungarian Jew.
There was a restaurant in Berlin where all the artists came, and there was a piano player, you know, and we knew all the people. And one evening, a whole lot of Nazis in uniform came into the restaurant. They told us, get up. And the first man who came in said, the right hand up. And to the piano player, he said, now play the Horst Wessel-Lied, their anthem. Well, they were so new, the Hitlerites, that the man hardly knew that tune. And we sat next to him, and I said, for heaven's sake, play it. My brother-in-law put the left hand up, he didn't know, so the Nazi came and put it down and put the right hand up. And so I said to my husband, I'm out, I'm going out. I got up, he hadn't even paid the bill, and there was a Nazi. She said, the Jews are leaving. Well, I went into the street, I got my coat. And when my husband had paid the bill and came out, I said, Marcel, I want to leave. You see, I say I have a bad memory, but things like that you don't forget.
Mary and Bobby had been to Poland and Germany in 1934, and he had filmed the dramatic changes occurring on the streets, the increasing power of uniformed officials. They had seen for themselves the burgeoning swastika. Hearing the Hellman story back at home and developing his film could only have increased Bobby's confused thoughts regarding Mary's father, Wilfrid, who was chairman of the Anglo-German Fellowship. It was left to the Jewish Chronicle to point out that if Wilfrid's two daughters, Mary and Edwina, had been living in Germany, they would have been sent to the ghettos.
I remember very clearly my father said, I just want to tell you something, that Raleigh Castle was Jewish, and he was a great man, he was a wonderful man, and we wouldn't be living the sort of life we live now if he hadn't come over with nothing and made a fortune and been tremendously philanthropic and started all sorts of hospitals and charities and things with his money. But he said there are some people, for some extraordinary reason, who dislike Jews. Now, I want you to always feel proud of the eighth of you that is Jewish. And that, of course, has stayed with me all my life.
Most people felt that Germany had been very badly treated at the Peace of Versailles after the First World War, and that what Hitler was doing was, for example, in Austria, simply marching into his own backyard. He was merely claiming back a bit of territory that was legitimately his. So, on the whole, during the late 1930s, the aristocratic class supported Chamberlain and was in favour of appeasement. And to some extent, there were people who were really very pro-Hitler. The 30s were a period when modern propaganda was born. It was very difficult for people to work out what was true. Were the purge trials genuine? Was there really a famine in the Ukraine? Stalin denied it. He was exporting grain. He couldn't, surely there couldn't have been famine. So everybody was busy telling lies. In Hitler's case, they were very big lies. In Britain's case, they were subtle economies with the truth. There was a lot of upper-class travelling between the wars, partly because, people were fascinated by what was really going on abroad. So the impulse, in particular, to find out what was happening behind what subsequently became called the Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe, what was really happening. all sorts of people paid the pilgrimage to Moscow to see whether this really was the future and whether it worked, whether communism was a viable system. And of course they put on great displays for the tourists to try and fool them. For example, they took them to model prisons, which were sort of palatial and very, very nice and bore little or no resemblance to the Lubyanka, where they were shooting people in the back of the neck, that sort of thing. So there was a great deal of upper-class tourism just for the sheer excitement of being able to go abroad and to find out what was happening.
Their tour of the Soviet Union had been stage-managed by the authorities, but they hadn't succeeded in pulling the wool over Bobby's eyes. His film images would reveal the truth. He may have left Britain an upper-class tourist, but at least he did not return, like so many of his peers, a communist sympathizer. By now, Bobby was absolutely determined to make his mark in Parliament, and played on his flying record to proclaim that aeroplanes were the key to Britain's defence. The Air Force was the Cinderella of the armed forces, and Bobby assumed the role of fairy godmother. After all, his air-mindedness was based on sound personal experience.
It was only somebody with a rare understanding of what Hitlerism meant, like Churchill, who was very robust and very tough-minded about the whole thing, who said, look, these people are barbarians, they're going to go on until they conquer the whole world if we let them, and we've jolly well got to stop them. And I think it was that great perspicacity on the part of not just Churchill, but those who supported that line. I mean, they were the people who really sought the truth of things.
By the late 1930s, Britain would be facing its greatest political challenge, and as always, Bobby was in the thick of it. At the general election of 1935, he had been returned as MP for Marylebone with the largest majority in London, and the old gang in the House had no choice but to accommodate him in their midst. But now what fueled his ambition was the prospect of high office, the cabinet, or even beyond.